Please be seated. I don't know when it started, but somewhere along the line I began to be aware and trying to be aware of things people do that are often taken for granted, overlooked, or just plain not seen. You know, behind the scenes kind of stuff that because it goes unseen, can go unappreciated, or even not thought of, unless of course someone did not do it, or did it wrong. A theater production, a musical or recording or a concert, an organized team sport, what goes on in school buildings, the courts, restaurants, factories where the minds and labor of mechanical and other engineers make possible things like bridges, and, yes, the church, are only a handful of places where the unsung are sometimes the heroes, and no one knows it, except maybe the hero, or maybe her boss. If you've been around me long enough, you know, especially in Bible conversations, that one of my favorite characters in Scripture is Ananias. Not the one in Ananias and Sapphira, but the one in Acts chapter 9. Saul the persecutor is now blind in Damascus after his encounter with the risen Christ. God tells Ananias, one of the believers, to go and heal him. There's a conversation. Ananias has trouble with these marching orders, but he obeys God and goes to this feared enemy. He even comes to the point of calling the future apostle Brother Saul. Saul is healed, and Ananias leaves. Not just leaves that home, but the New Testament. We never hear of him again except when Paul refers to him in telling his story later on in the book of Acts. Yet how critical was he, his obedience. He is often forgotten, but on his obedience, one could argue, turned the future direction of world history. Mr. Behind the Scenes. I thought of this as I reflected on the picture Mark paints for us, a queue of people lined up, putting their offerings into the trumpet-shaped containers for the temple treasury in Jerusalem. And we heard Dorothy read, Jesus sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large amounts, large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then Jesus called his disciples, that's Mark's version of saying, church, listen. Then he called his disciples and said to them, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had. Many people put in a lot of money. They gave out of their abundance. That means they would still be just fine financially. They still had abundance. Sacrificial giving for them, this was not. Among such well-to-do folks, well then who's going to notice the poor widow and think highly of what she gives, if they even notice her at all? She's an afterthought compared to all the others, sort of behind the scenes. While the disciples see all the others chipping in generously, Jesus sees her, the widow, who is there not to be seen, but to give what she had in service to God. How did Jesus know this was a poor widow? Did he know that she had failed to understand her finances? Did he know that she had made some pretty bad business decisions? No. Let me quote from my friend and colleague, Reverend Howard Boswell, preaching on this text in suburban Buffalo, New York, morning. He explains, the widow is poor because all widows were poor. Almost from the beginning, widows were the second most vulnerable group in Jewish society, second only slightly to the orphans in terms of vulnerability. When a woman lost her husband in that time and place, she lost everything. You see, property passed from father to son when there were no sons to the closest male relative. Well, so widows either depended on the kindness of their family, which was sometimes not there, or on the kindness of strangers who put food or money into their begging bowl. So, Howard wrote, for Mark to call her a poor widow is redundant. As the crowd dropped their large offerings into the treasury, her gift was seemingly lost. The 2 coins she gave were what a day laborer would earn in 12 and a half minutes. Jesus said it was everything she had. Moments before, Jesus had berated some of the scribes as devouring widows' houses. Now, whatever that means specifically, for all we know, her house could have been one of the devoured. At any rate, those 2 copper coins were for her a spectacular offer. How could she do it? Maybe she, like Ananias, faced her fears and trusted God to provide for her anyway, as God had provided for her up to that moment. Maybe the treasury had been benevolent to her in the past, and so she felt an obligation to also give back to it. Maybe this was just her one way to give back to the Lord for some of her devotion in addition to following Torah. That was like the only other way she had. If she believed God had given her everything she had, when it was offering time, she was led to give back to God everything she had. A spectacular offering, observed and praised by none other than the Son of God, who soon enough would also make an offering, an astounding offering of himself. Speaking of giving ourselves, or at least offering ourselves, we also have the example of Ruth. There is much in the plot line of Ruth we do not have time to go into. But, as Dorothy mentioned, Ruth and Boaz had already met, talked, broke bread together. He had made sure to provide for her from the gleanings of his fields. Then, Naomi made the pitch at the start of chapter 3 for Ruth to go to Boaz on the threshing floor and bring herself physically to him after he's lying down. Remember the words she said, Naomi said, now wash and anoint yourself, put on some perfume. Now wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. Ruth is putting herself out there. She is offering herself to Boaz. Now, commentators differ on what it means to uncover his feet. Some take it literally, as a bold but humble way for Ruth to offer herself to Boaz. Others take into account that in Hebrew, this phrase can mean a more overt sexual advance. For instance, my Oxford Study Bible, the notes for this say, there is a slight overtone of sexual intimacy in the passage, since feet in Hebrew can be a euphemism for genitals. It immediately adds that the relationship between Ruth and Boaz is honorable according to the standards of the time, however, is shown by subsequent events. She literally has skin in the game, and it is not without risk. It also has a chance for reward based on the favor Boaz has already shown her. But she's essentially asking him to marry her by a next of kin kind of obligation that Boaz doesn't have because he's not her brother-in-law. I would also call what she did a spectacular offering of her body herself for the good of herself and Naomi. How many times might you or I have been in a relationship where we laid it all on the line for a chance of happiness and permanence and a stronger relationship with that person or family? It may or may not have had anything sexual involved. If it did, it has a unique dynamic that, if the offering were neglected or refused, scars deeply. And that scar can lead one to question anew, what is worth such an offering again? Maybe it is too high an offering until much more blessing is assured by covenant or something as powerful. The widow gave all that she had out of devotion to the Lord and to the good works of the temple. Ruth gave all she had in hopes of protection, provision, and family. We know not what reward the widow got, beyond being praised by Jesus, but wouldn't that be reward enough for us? And now we know also, in hindsight, that Ruth's offering was not only accepted, it bore fruit. Together, Ruth and Boaz became the great-grandparents of King David and part of the family tree of Jesus of Nazareth. And she was a Moabitess. Astounding offerings from the widow and Ruth. The third person who made that spectacular offering in our stories is, of course, Jesus. The larger context of the story in Mark lets the reader see that the offering of the widow, of all that she had, is, after all, a foreshadowing of Jesus giving all that he had. It was soon to follow. The widow gave dearly of money, and in that sense also security. Ruth gave dearly of her body and personal safety. You couldn't be in a much more vulnerable position than she put herself into. Jesus gave his very life, preceded by brutal suffering. For a greater blessing, he trusted his Father to make real. If you've been here the past 3 weeks or so, as Dorothy mentioned, you've heard passages from the letter to the Hebrews again and again from the lectionary. I'm following the lectionary at this point of the year, and they have been building on each other about Jesus the superior priest, Jesus the superior offering, and with superior blood, the superior place. It wasn't the real temple in Jerusalem made with hands, but essentially it was an offering in heaven. He's making the superior covenant as the mediator of a new one, grounded in grace, which led God to bring Jesus' death and resurrection to the fore for us. Dorothy read the ancient words, "For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands," a mere copy of the true one, "but he entered into a heavenly one, heaven itself, now to appear before the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself again and again, as the high priest enters the holy place year after year, with blood that is not his own. But as it is, Christ has appeared once for all, at the end of the age, to remove sin by the sacrifice of himself." And then he goes on, the writer goes on to talk about him appearing a second time to save those who were eagerly waiting for him on earth. Hebrews even uses the word offering to describe Jesus' passion and death. And just as it is appointed for mortals once to die and after that the judgment, Christ, having been offered once for all to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time. Now that brings about, Christ's death. And we do not hear a whole lot about Good Friday during the autumn or stewardship season, but here it is. An offering was Jesus. And although Hebrews 9 is about his dying for our sins and rising again, Jesus was also an offering through his life. Through the ways he challenged the scribes and Pharisees. Through his mercy on sinners. Through his refusal to be cowed by Pilate, Herod, or the chief elders. Through his claiming the mission from Isaiah 61 and 58 about coming to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. The year of the Lord's favor is generally agreed to mean the year of Jubilee, described in Leviticus 25, when debts were forgiven, lands taken over by others in the last 50 years, perhaps consolidated in the hands of a few, now go back to the original owners without cost. Israelite slaves were free. It was an economic reset button, as I put it when I preached on this some years ago, that passage. An economic reset button that Israel probably never tried because it would have upset the apple cart too much. And for Jesus to say he came to fulfill those scriptures was a claim to pursue or be something that would likewise upset the apple cart. He put himself out there in his life as well as where his teaching in life led, and was ultimately killed by the powers that be. By his life as well as his death, his was a spectacular offering. You and I were not the poor widow, not Ruth, and assuredly not Jesus. Their offerings were for them to make, and only theirs. They were costly, but made in faith for the greater good of themselves, and as it turned out for Israel, and all the families of the earth who are blessed, a la promised Abraham. In this time of stewardship, with our own 2015 challenges and blessings, our resources, hopes, plans, and debts, and visions, what offerings might you and I make? As part of the family of faith that transcends time and includes Ruth, the widow, and Jesus, are there offerings you, I, or St. Peter's United Church of Christ can make that might be called spectacular? Even if few people see them or know about them, even if they are behind the scenes and get no ink in the newsletter. If only the Lord saw them, what spectacular offerings might be ours